All right, hello, legal studies class, and welcome to our very last topic of the year, which is all about rights. So, what we're going to do, apparently, I don't know why I'm saying apparently, this is actually the real thing, but this topic is massive, and we're cutting it down significantly based on how crazy the year's been. So we're only going to be looking at 10A and 10B from the textbook. But 10A is ridiculously massive. It's being cut up into 4 parts, and this is long enough as it is. So what we're going to do, last day of term today for you guys, we're just going to smash through this, get you some notes from this. There's like 4 questions on a roller that you have to do, and then it's the holiday. So let's just go through this quickly, talk about our rights, talk about some examples of rights in the current Victoria, Australia, and the insanity that is living through a pandemic. And then we'll be good. It'll be the holidays, and you can not think about legal studies for 2 weeks. Unless you really enjoy thinking about legal studies in your free time, in which case, good on you, you weirdo. So the key knowledge that we're going to be looking at here is an overview of the ways in which rights are protected in Australia, such as the Australian Constitution, the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, statute law, and common law. So these various different ways of rights that they have our rights outlined in them and how they are protected. So human rights, what are human rights? Listing some of human rights, and do they apply here in Australia? So we've got right to education, right to information, free speech, right to practice religion, a right to move freely, which kind of doesn't exist at the moment, to move freely between states, or for you suckers from Metro Melbourne into regional Victoria, if you want to come here, $5,000 fine. Good luck with that. Meanwhile, we can travel. We can go anywhere. I can go outside without a real reason at the moment. I can just because I want to. Regional Victoria is crazy. It's a whole different world. All these different rights. Right to free speech, as long as it doesn't negatively impact someone else. Many of these rights apply in Australia. But a definition of human rights, and you definitely need this. Write this down somewhere, copy and paste it somewhere. I'll put just like this normal PowerPoint on our team's page too if you want to steal things from it. But human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, whatever our nationality, place, residence, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. We're all equally entitled to our human rights without discrimination, and these rights are all interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. So they can't be taken away, they can't be divided, they're specific to you. So basically, you can't do anything that infringes on someone else's human rights, and they can't do something that infringes upon yours, because that will lead to some legal issues occurring. So what is a right? A right is a legal or moral entitlement to have or do something, and rights normally relate to freedoms such as the right to life. So in Australia, we've got 5 fundamental freedoms that the Commonwealth Government has stated that we all have. So we've got the right to speech, to speak or write about any topic. That's free speech essentially. You can write or speak about any topic as long as it doesn't negatively impact on someone else. Association, you can join any lawful group. So that means like associations, clubs, etc. As long as it's lawful and doesn't negatively impact on other people's rights, that's fine. Assembly, to meet with others in public or private spaces. Yeah, that's not really happening right now. You don't really have that right at the moment, but usually you would. And right, religion, to practice any religion you choose. That's a very positive thing, means that people can have their own faith. And the right to movement, so the movement from state to state and leave and re-enter Australia. So 2 of our 5 fundamental freedoms aren't really in existence in Metro Melbourne at the moment, but these are the ones that every other year would continue to exist, and hopefully after November will start to exist again. I really need the state-to-state movement to open up again. I need to hopefully go to New South Wales or something. So areas of law where our rights come from. So we've got statute law. Parliaments at all levels have passed legislation to protect a range of rights. So these are laws that exist. So like things like the fact of assault being a law stops you from infringing someone's personal space and their rights because of that. Their right to be free from harm. Those laws prevent those negative things from occurring and rights from being infringed. Common law, courts have recognised and enforced certain rights such as the right to silence and the right to a fair trial. The Constitution protects a limited number of rights which are outlined within it, and the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, which is an act of Victorian Parliament that sets out basic human rights and freedoms in one document, and its purpose is to protect and promote human rights. So we'll get into what all these are as we go through. So what you know should look like this. As we go through it, you could then fill it in based on that, or open the PowerPoint, steal this table, and then just fill it in. Unless you really like making tables. Once again, if that's you, you're strange. So getting to definitions of each of them. So common law, also known as case law, precedent, judge-made law, you should already know this. Express rights are clearly written in the Constitution and entrenched within the Constitution. Implied rights are rights that are not explicitly stated in the Constitution, but are found or interpreted by the High Court. And structural protection, which is systems or mechanisms in the Commonwealth Constitution that indirectly work to protect the community by preventing being abused by the Commonwealth. So, for instance, representative government and separation of powers is an example of structural protection. It prevents one kind of party from having too much power over the community. So the Australian Constitution is a document setting out the legal structure of Parliament and its lawmaking authority. So we have a few rights in our Constitution, but they're limited in scope. The few rights listed in our Constitution impose limitations on Parliament. So stop Parliament or the government from taking our rights or gaining too much power. Because if government has too much power, then that is not great for society. And you kind of see at the moment, like there are issues, people complaining in Victoria about Dan Andrews being drunk with power, being a dictator, rah, 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 because people are, with the state of disaster and state of emergency powers, the government has extra power and we have slightly less rights to try and manage a pandemic. Your opinions on that don't really matter for this, but it's an interesting thing to look at and why people are upset about it. So some rights by the law. So a Bill of Rights is sometimes called a Declaration of Rights or a Charter of Rights, and it's a list of the most important rights to the citizens of a country. Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights. You hear about it from America all the time. They talk about their Bill of Rights, their amendment rights, etc. So without a comprehensive Charter of Rights, the protection of rights in Australia comes from different places. Due to the division of powers, not all states have identical arrangements, so there's no consistency across the nation. So in simple terms, we have no set rules from one document. So our rights come from all those, the four different sources that we talked about earlier. So the Constitution, statute law, common law, and the Victorian Charter of Human Rights, because we don't have a Bill of Rights listing them all in one spot. Express rights are the rights clearly stated in the Constitution. They're entrenched and can only be changed by a referendum. Not many referendums have ever happened in Australia, only a couple. And there are rights which the Constitution guarantees against the Commonwealth. So these are religious freedom, trial by jury, just terms of compensation, residential non-discrimination, so not being discriminated against based on where you live, and interstate trade and commerce, so goods and services can move freely between states. So that's the only 5 express rights that we have in Victoria. Express Act as a limitation on Parliament. These rights tend to be expressed as limitations on Commonwealth Parliament and lawmaking rather than positive rights for individuals. These 5 rights are protected because Parliament cannot pass legislation that infringes upon those protected rights. They can't do anything that stops you from doing those 5 things. And so it stops Parliament from making any laws that gives them too much power or infringes upon your rights too much. So structural protection in representative government. So Australia's political system is one which the people elect members of Parliament to represent them. The political idea of representation is based on the idea that some person or institution acts on behalf of the people by reflecting their beliefs, attitudes, and perspectives. So then they make laws, debate issues, monitor the expenditure of public money, and it's not feasible for all of Australia to be involved all the time. So we have others represent us. So by voting in a certain person from a certain party, the general idea is that they represent the ideas of the majority of society, and therefore when they make laws, debate issues, and spend public money, they're doing it in the best interests of that society. once again, it's also led to a lot of the issues we have now with like the people who haven't voted for a certain person or whose ideals now conflict with it, leads to them kind of being upset about that, which is kind of fair enough and kind of, it's a lot. Representative government is the lawmakers acting in a way that reflects the community values and expectations. So this is achieved by voters knowing what lawmakers do and propose to do in future, so being clear and in their communication. Voters discussing with each other and lawmakers what they think the law should be, so listening to the public and changing things based on that. Voters making informed choices at elections and ensuring most Australians participate in elections, which tends to happen because if you don't vote, you get fined. So that's how we get most people having a say in Australian elections. Then we have separation of powers. So governments are subject to the rule of law, which means that the government, like everyone else, must act within the law. This is reinforced by the separation of powers. Those who enforce the laws, the judiciary, are independent of the government so that they will enforce the law fairly and treat all parties, including the government, equally. And the rule of law means that, let me just get rid of my image for a second so I can see the words, is that the law according to the courts applies, is that the law which rules is the law according to the courts, and it applies to everything. So no matter what. So there's an interesting example that came out this morning. So Scott Morrison can't go to the AFL Grand Final. He's going to be the first Prime Minister in history to miss the AFL Grand Final because if he goes to Queensland, he has to quarantine for 14 days. And so that's the law applying to everyone equally. No matter, because he's even though he's Prime Minister, the law applies to him the same as everyone else, so he can't skip that process. And therefore, if he's to go to Queensland, he has to quarantine like anyone else from New South Wales would, and therefore he'll miss the grand final because of that, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at 2020. So we've got the Australian Constitution, which breaks things into executive power, which is the power to administer the law, legislative power, the power to make laws, and judicial power, which is the power to apply the law. So the Governor General, the Queen's representative, the Prime Minister and senior ministers, they administer the law, they can set the rules around law. The power to make law comes from House of Representatives and the Senate. We've talked about that a lot in previous topics. And the High Court and other law enforcement bodies are the people who can apply the law and enforce the law, which comes under judicial power. Here are some YouTube clips if you want to watch them about those certain parts. You probably should. What else are you doing with your life right now? You're in lockdown. And so enforcing constitutional rights. So the rights in the Constitution are fully enforceable by the High Court. A person who feels that the Commonwealth has passed a law that infringes upon their rights can challenge the law in the High Court and has the power to declare such a law to be invalid. If this happens, the Commonwealth Parliament can amend the law or change the Constitution through a referendum. So are border closures illegal? There's a lot of interesting things going on where people are attempting to sue the government around border closures. There's actually another interesting one at the moment where someone from Mornington, a cafe owner, is taking the government to court over the curfew and the fact they want the curfew abolished because it's infringes upon their rights. So many states across Australia have closed their borders. Maybe these border closures contravene the Constitution. So we've got residential non-discrimination. So you can't discriminate against people based on where they live. So therefore you can't really say, well, you're from Metro Melbourne, you can't come into any other state. But that's what people have done. Interstate trade and commerce. So it's also stopping like workers from like going to work where if they work interstate or traveling for work. So someone could take that case to the High Court. So because of rights are being infringed technically there, it'd be interesting to see what comes up there because rights are being infringed for a specific reason. And then so it all comes down to whether people's rights being infringed is worse than the greater good that it's meant to be causing. So it'd be a very, very interesting one to look at. So some strengths and weaknesses, these are all from page 398 of your Ed Rollo textbook. So some strengths, so entrenched rights, so the 5 express rights can only be removed by a referendum, which is good. It means that the government or parliament can't just override our rights, which means that we're always going to have them unless a referendum where people vote for that. Implying rights, the High Court has the ability to find implied rights, which is good, it protects them further. Enforceability, the express and implied rights are fully enforceable by the High Court, which is excellent because it means that if the government infringes upon our rights, the High Court can actually take action about that. They cannot be overridden, so none of the protected rights can be overridden by Parliament. Once again, great, protects them. The separation of powers is an effective way to protect human rights because it means that one particular party doesn't have too much power over the people. Representative government is great because it means that the rights should reflect what the community wants because they vote in someone and that person creates those laws. And because they fear losing office, they're going to do what the public wants. Weaknesses of them is that we have limited express rights. So there's only 5 of them, which makes it hard to, like, there are a lot of rights that aren't covered in there. There's narrow application. The express and implied rights are relatively narrow in their operation, so Section 80 only applies to Commonwealth indictable offences. Section 116 does not prevent the states from passing laws to restrict the free practice of religion. So therefore, individual states could ban certain religions, which kind of defeats the purpose of that right. And the implied right only protects communication about political issues in Australia rather than free speech more generally. There's a need for challenge, so a law breaching express right operates until it's challenged in the High Court. So they could breach our rights until someone takes it to the High Court, nothing happens. The court cannot award damages to a person affected by a law breaching anyone's express or implied rights. So they can only change the law, they can't actually get financial benefit for it. The High Court doesn't give advisory opinions on the protection of rights, and representative government doesn't always protect minorities. So the fact of the majority voting in a government, that government might not look out for the rights of certain segments of society. You see it with Indigenous Australians for a long period of time have not really been looked after at all, and their rights have been infringed, like they weren't considered human beings for a long period of time. And one of the cases we'll end up looking at about Eddie Mabo, they just took land from Aboriginal people, even though it was theirs. And that's a big, big issue. So what you're going to do from this, read the pages of your textbook. They'll be useful. They're probably more useful than me. And then complete 10A, questions 8 to 10 and question 24. It's a massive section. We're going to go through more of it at the start of next term, but if you get this done, you probably smash it out pretty quickly. You're done for the term. And then you do not have to think about this subject for quite some time. So other than that, I hope you have a wonderful break. It's been good to talk aimlessly at you for 17 and a half minutes. Have a great rest of your Friday, and I will see you in like 3 weeks when class actually comes back in person. Goodbye.